Imagine discovering that Adolf Hitler was part of your family. For his descendants, this wasn't just history, it was their reality. How did they cope with this burden? What measures did they take to distance themselves from their infamous relative? In today's video, we uncover the hidden lives of Hitler's family members after World War II. From name changes to secret relocations, their stories reveal the complex aftermath of being connected to history's most notorious dictator. As World War II ended in May 1945, the name Hitler became synonymous with evil. For most people around the world, it was a historical burden to remember and revile, a symbol of unprecedented atrocity and human suffering. But for Adolf Hitler's immediate family, it was a personal nightmare they couldn't escape. Trapped between blood ties and global condemnation, Hitler's relatives faced an impossible situation that would define the rest of their lives and the lives of their descendants. The war's end brought no peace for these individuals, only a different kind of torment, one that came not from bombs and bullets, but from shame, guilt, and an inescapable association with genocide. The Hitler family tree was more complex than many realize. Adolf was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria-Hungary, to Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl. His father Alois had been born illegitimate as Alois Schicklgruber before taking the Hitler surname. This complicated family history meant that Adolf had numerous half-siblings from his father's previous marriages, as well as a full sister who died in infancy and a younger brother, Edmund, who died at age 6. The surviving siblings and half-siblings would each face their own unique challenges in the aftermath of their brother's infamy. Hitler's younger sister, Paula, was perhaps the closest living relative after the war ended. Born Paula Hitler on January 21, 1896, in Hafeld, Austria, she was the last surviving child of Alois and Clara Hitler. Paula had lived in obscurity during the Nazi regime, working as a secretary in Vienna and going to great lengths to conceal her family connection. She used the surname Wolf, ironically, one of Adolf's favorite pseudonyms and his childhood nickname, even during the war years, hoping that this thin veil of anonymity might protect her from unwanted attention. After the war ended, Paula's life took a dramatic turn. In May 1945, she was detained by United States intelligence officers who had tracked down Hitler's relatives as part of their efforts to understand the Führer's psychology and to ensure no remaining family members posed a security threat. During the extensive debriefing that followed, one of the agents noted her striking physical resemblance to her brother, particularly in her facial structure and mannerisms. The resemblance was so pronounced that it made some of the interrogators uncomfortable, as if they were speaking to a female version of the man who had caused such devastation. Paula revealed during these interrogations that the Soviets had seized her home in Austria immediately after the war ended, turning her out with nothing more than the clothes on her back. Meanwhile, the Americans had taken possession of her apartment in Vienna, leaving her essentially homeless and dependent on the charity of others. Despite her dire circumstances, Paula mentioned that she was attempting to learn English at the time, perhaps hoping that mastering the language of her interrogators might somehow improve her situation, or open up opportunities in the post-war world. Reflecting on her childhood during these interviews, Paula described her relationship with her brother as complex and sometimes contradictory. She spoke of frequent quarrels during their youth, the kind of sibling rivalry that seemed normal and innocent in retrospect. Yet she also expressed deep affection for Adolf, remembering moments of kindness and the protective nature he had shown toward her when they were young. These memories stood in stark contrast to the monster the world had come to know, creating a profound cognitive dissonance that Paula struggled to reconcile. Most controversially, despite the overwhelming evidence presented to her, Paula expressed disbelief that her brother could have been responsible for the Holocaust. She claimed that the Adolf Hitler she had known as a child and young man could never have ordered such atrocities. This denial, whether genuine or a psychological defense mechanism, would characterize much of her post-war life. Some historians have suggested that Paula's refusal to accept her brother's crimes was less about actual disbelief and more about an inability to process the magnitude of what he had done. How could she reconcile the brother who had helped support her financially with the man who had orchestrated the deaths of 6 million Jews? Paula was released from American custody when it became clear she had no involvement in Nazi activities and posed no security threat. However, her freedom came with its own burdens. Paula's post-war life was marked by desperate attempts to distance herself from her infamous brother while simultaneously defending his memory in private conversations. She officially changed her surname to Wolf in the late 1940s, hoping this would provide some measure of protection and anonymity. The irony of using Adolf's childhood nickname apparently escaped her, or perhaps it was her way of maintaining some connection to the brother she remembered from their youth. Paula lived in seclusion near Berchtesgaden, the very region where her brother had built his mountain retreat, the Berghof. She inhabited a small, sparsely furnished apartment that stood in stark contrast to the luxury her brother had enjoyed during his years in power. The apartment contained little more than basic furniture, a few photographs from happier times, and books she had collected over the years. Paula survived on meagre savings that she had managed to hide from the authorities, and on occasional charity from former SS members and members of her brother's inner circle who felt some obligation to support Hitler's sister. These benefactors visited in secret, often under cover of darkness, bringing food, money, and news from the outside world. For many of these former Nazis, supporting Paula was a way of maintaining loyalty to their fallen Führer, even though doing so could bring unwanted attention from the authorities. Paula accepted their help out of necessity, though she remained guarded in her conversations, never fully trusting anyone and always fearful that she might be betrayed or that her benefactors might be arrested, cutting off her lifeline. In February 1959, Paula made a rare exception to her self-imposed isolation. She agreed to an interview with Peter Morley, a documentary producer for British television who had spent months trying to convince her to speak on camera. This conversation became the only filmed interview of her entire life, a remarkable historical document that captured Paula in her later years. During the interview, conducted in German with translation provided afterward, Paula spoke carefully and chose her words with obvious deliberation. She discussed her childhood memories, her brother's early life, and her own experiences during and after the war. When pressed about the Holocaust and her brother's responsibility, Paula's responses were evasive and contradictory. She admitted that terrible things had happened, but suggested that Adolf had been misled by his subordinates, or that he had not been fully aware of what was being done in his name. These claims rang hollow to most viewers, but they provided insight into the psychological mechanisms Paula had developed to cope with her impossible situation. How could she live with herself if she fully acknowledged what her brother had done? Denial, it seemed, was her only path to sanity. Paula lived out her remaining years in increasing isolation and poverty. Her health declined steadily, and she rarely ventured outside her small apartment. Neighbors who knew her identity kept their distance, while those who didn't occasionally showed her small kindnesses, unaware of who she really was. On June 1st, 1960, Paula Hitler-Wulff died in Berchtesgaden at the age of 64. She was buried in a cemetery near the town, her grave marked with her adopted surname. Even in death, she sought to escape the Hitler name. Angela Hitler, Adolf's older half-sister, presented a different face of the family tragedy. Born Angela Hitler on July 28, 1883, she was 13 years older than Adolf and came from their father Alois Hitler's second marriage to Franziska Matzelsberger. During Adolf's rise to power and the height of the Nazi regime, Angela had been one of his closest confidants. She worked as his housekeeper at the Berghof during the 1920s and early 1930s, managing his household affairs and serving as his hostess for important guests when no other suitable woman was available for the role. Angela's relationship with her half-brother was complex and evolved significantly over time. In the early days of Adolf's political career, she was supportive and even proud of his achievements. She saw him as a man who had overcome tremendous obstacles: poverty, rejection from art school, homelessness in Vienna, to become a powerful political figure. Angela took pride in her role at the Berghof, enjoying the status and comfort that came with being the Führer's housekeeper. She managed a staff of servants, oversaw elaborate dinners and parties, and played the role of the respectable family woman who could provide Adolf with an air of domesticity and normalcy. However, as the years passed, Angela became increasingly uncomfortable with certain aspects of her brother's life, particularly his relationship with Eva Braun. Angela had initially hoped that Adolf might marry someone of higher social standing, perhaps a woman from an aristocratic or politically connected family who could enhance his image and provide him with legitimate heirs. Eva Braun, in Angela's view, was beneath Adolf's station, a simple photographer's assistant with no particular education or refinement. Angela made her disapproval known, which created tension between her and her brother. The final break came in 1936, when Angela could no longer tolerate Eva Braun's increasing presence at the Berghof and Adolf's obvious affection for her. After a series of arguments, Angela left her position as housekeeper and returned to Dresden, where she lived with her second husband, Martin Hamitsch, an architect. This departure was painful for both siblings. Adolf had relied on Angela to provide a semblance of family life and respectability, while Angela had enjoyed the power and prestige that came with her position. However, her moral objections and personal pride ultimately made it impossible for her to continue. Despite their estrangement over Eva Braun, Angela remained publicly loyal to her brother throughout the war. She never spoke against him or the Nazi regime, even as evidence of atrocities mounted and the war turned against Germany. This loyalty would prove costly after the war ended. Unlike Paula, who had maintained a low profile throughout the Nazi era, Angela's prominent role at the Berghof and her public association with Adolf made her a person of interest to Allied investigators. After the war, Angela was interrogated by Allied authorities, though less extensively than Paula. She consistently spoke favourably about her brother during these interviews, defending his character and insisting that the Adolf Hitler she had known was not capable of the crimes attributed to him. Angela asserted that neither she nor her brother had been aware of the Holocaust, a claim that strained credulity given her close proximity to the centres of Nazi power and her brother's inner circle. Most historians view this assertion as either deliberate deception or willful ignorance. Angela had certainly been in a position to know or at least suspect what was happening. Angela's interrogators were skeptical of her claims, noting that she had lived at the heart of the Nazi regime during its early years and had socialized with Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, and other high-ranking Nazis who were directly involved in planning and implementing the final solution. However, no evidence was found linking Angela directly to any crimes, and she was eventually released without charges. The Allies concluded that while Angela had certainly benefited from her brother's power and had supported the regime through her loyalty, she had not been an active participant in Nazi crimes. After her release, Angela lived a quiet, reclusive life in Germany. She moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to establish roots or attract attention. Former neighbours later recalled her as a bitter, angry woman who refused to discuss her past and grew hostile when pressed about her relationship with Adolf Hitler. Angela seemed to view herself as a victim, someone who had been unfairly judged and punished for her family connection, despite having done nothing wrong. This victim mentality prevented her from ever truly reckoning with the moral implications of her brother's actions or her own complicity through silence and support. Angela Hitler died on October 30th, 1949, in Hanover at the age of 66. Her death came just 4 years after the war ended, and unlike Paula, she did not live long enough to see how history would ultimately judge her brother and the Nazi regime. Angela died still believing, or at least claiming to believe, that Adolf had been a great man who had been misunderstood and betrayed by his subordinates. Her funeral was a small, private affair attended only by her immediate family. Even in death, the Hitler name cast such a dark shadow that few wanted to be associated with it. The contrast between Paula's and Angela's post-war lives reflects the different ways Hitler's siblings attempted to cope with their family burden. Paula retreated into complete anonymity, changing her name and living in poverty rather than risk any association with her brother's legacy. Angela, on the other hand, maintained a defiant pride in her relationship with Adolf, refusing to fully condemn him even when doing so might have made her life easier. Both women died lonely, isolated deaths, rejected by a world that could not separate them from their brother's crimes, no matter how much they insisted on their own innocence. Yet Paula and Angela were not the only Hitler siblings to face the consequences of their family name. The story of the Hitler family extends beyond these two sisters to include half-siblings from Alois Hitler Sr.'s earlier marriages, each with their own complicated relationship to the dictator, and their own unique struggles in the post-war world. These individuals found themselves caught in an impossible web of family loyalty, personal survival, and historical judgment that would shape every aspect of their remaining years. Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf's older half-brother, faced his challenges in a dramatically different way from his sisters. Born Alois Matzelsberger on January 13, 1882, he was the son of Alois Hitler Sr. and his second wife, Franziska Matzelsberger. Alois Jr. was 7 years older than Adolf, and their relationship during childhood and adolescence was marked by conflict and rivalry. The two brothers were never close, separated by both age and temperament. While Adolf was moody, artistic, and increasingly radical in his political views, Alois Jr. was more practical, interested in business, and less concerned with ideology. Alois Jr.'s early life was troubled and restless. He left home at 14 after a series of violent arguments with his strict father, and he spent years drifting through various jobs and cities. In 1909, he was convicted of theft in Vienna and served a 5-month prison sentence, an incident that Adolf later used to distance himself from his half-brother. Alois eventually settled in Dublin, Ireland, where he married an Irish woman named Bridget Dowling in 1910. The couple had a son, William Patrick Hitler, in 1911, before the marriage fell apart. Alois abandoned his wife and son, returning to Germany and starting a new life without them. In Germany, Alois Jr. attempted to establish himself in business. He opened a small restaurant in Hamburg and later tried his hand at various business ventures, none of which proved particularly successful. When Adolf rose to power in 1933, Alois Jr. found himself in an awkward position. On one hand, having a brother who was now the Führer of Germany could open doors and provide opportunities. On the other hand, Adolf made it clear that he preferred to distance himself from his half-brother, whom he viewed as an embarrassment due to Alois's criminal record and his abandonment of his Irish family. Despite Adolf's coldness, Alois Jr. attempted to capitalize on the family connection. He briefly ran a beer hall in Berlin, promoting it as the establishment owned by the Führer's brother. This business venture angered Adolf, who saw it as a crass attempt to profit from the family name and as a potential source of embarrassment. Adolf's associates made it clear to Alois that he should keep a low profile and avoid drawing attention to their relationship. Alois complied, though he resented being forced to hide his connection to Germany's most powerful man. Alois married a second time to a German woman named Hedwig Heidemann, with whom he had a son named Heinz Hitler, born in 1920. Heinz grew up in the shadow of his famous uncle, but, unlike his half-brother William Patrick in Ireland, he embraced the Nazi regime with enthusiasm. Heinz joined the Wehrmacht and fought on the Eastern Front during World War II. Tragically, Heinz was captured by Soviet forces during the Battle of Stalingrad in January 1943. He died in Soviet captivity, though the exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he died of illness or malnutrition in a prisoner of war camp, while others claim he was executed when his identity as Hitler's nephew became known. The loss of his son devastated Alois Jr. and would haunt him for the rest of his life. After the war ended, Alois Jr. returned to Hamburg and attempted to restart his restaurant business. He emphasized his distance from and disagreement with his infamous half-brother, trying to present himself as someone who had merely shared a surname with the dictator but had played no role in the Nazi regime. Alois gave occasional interviews to journalists, always stressing his separation from Adolf's actions and claiming that he had been as much a victim of the war as anyone else. He portrayed himself as a simple businessman who had never supported the Nazis and had suffered because of his brother's crimes. However, the Hitler name proved to be more of a curse than a draw for his business ventures. Customers were reluctant to patronize an establishment owned by Hitler's brother, fearing both the social stigma and the possibility that Alois might be using profits to support former Nazis. Alois faced constant suspicion and scrutiny. Local authorities monitored his activities, former resistance members viewed him with hostility, and even those who might have been sympathetic kept their distance. Every action and word was analysed for hints of Nazi sympathy or signs that he might be in contact with former regime members hiding from justice. The psychological toll on Alois Jr. was significant. He grew bitter and resentful, feeling that he was being unfairly punished for crimes he had not committed. In private conversations with the few people he trusted, Alois complained about the injustice of his situation. He had never been a Nazi Party member, had never attended rallies or expressed support for his brother's policies, and yet he was treated as if he bore personal responsibility for the Holocaust. This sense of victimization prevented Alois from developing any real understanding of why people might view his family connection as significant, or why his attempts to profit from the Hitler name during the 1930s had been morally questionable. Alois Jr.'s health declined in the early 1950s. He suffered from various ailments, exacerbated by stress, poor diet during the war years, and the chronic anxiety of living under constant scrutiny. He became increasingly reclusive, venturing out only when necessary and avoiding any situation where he might be recognized or questioned about his brother. Alois Hitler Jr. died on May 9, 1956, in Hamburg at the age of 74. His death was reported in local newspapers with a brief mention of his relationship to Adolf Hitler, ensuring that even his obituary was defined by his infamous half-brother. Alois's widow Hedwig survived him by several years, living quietly in Hamburg until her own death. She rarely spoke about her husband's family or her own experiences during the war, maintaining the silence that seemed to be the only viable strategy for Hitler's relatives. The couple's son Heinz, who had died in Soviet captivity, became a footnote in history. A young man whose potential had been destroyed by a war started by his own uncle, and whose death brought additional grief to a family already burdened by infamy. The contrasting approaches of Paula, Angela, and Alois Jr. highlight the impossible situation faced by Hitler's immediate family. Paula chose complete anonymity, changing her name and living in poverty. Angela maintained a defiant loyalty to her brother while trying to minimize her own role in his regime. Alois Jr. attempted to openly rebuild his life while distancing himself from Adolf, only to find that the Hitler name was an anchor that dragged him down no matter what he did. None of these strategies proved entirely successful, and all three siblings died without ever fully escaping their brother's shadow. But the story of Hitler's family extends beyond his siblings to include nieces, nephews, and more distant relatives, each with their own harrowing tale of survival and struggle in the aftermath of World War II. These individuals, many of whom had never met Adolf Hitler or had only fleeting contact with him, nevertheless found their lives irrevocably altered by their family connection. The next generation of Hitlers would face challenges that were in some ways even more complex than those faced by Adolf's siblings, as they grappled with questions of identity, guilt, and legacy that had no easy answers. Among the most intriguing figures in this next generation was Geli Raubal, Adolf, Hitler's niece and the daughter of his half-sister, Angela. Geli was born Angela Maria Raubal on June 4, 1908, in Linz, Austria. She grew up in a relatively normal environment, the daughter of Angela Raubal and Leo Raubal Sr., a middle-class Austrian tax inspector. Geli's childhood was unremarkable until her famous uncle began his rise to power and took an intense personal interest in her life. Adolf became infatuated with his young niece, inviting her to live with him in his Munich apartment when she was 17 years old. The relationship between Adolf and Geli has been the subject of intense historical scrutiny and speculation. What is clear is that Adolf became possessively controlling of Geli, monitoring her activities, forbidding her from having romantic relationships with other men, and flying into rages when she attempted to assert her independence. Geli, for her part, seemed to fluctuate between enjoying the attention and lifestyle that came with being the Führer's favourite niece and feeling trapped by his obsessive control. She had ambitions to be an opera singer, but found her uncle's possessiveness stifling and his jealousy suffocating. On September 18, 1931, Geli Raubal was found dead in Adolf Hitler's Munich apartment, shot with his Walter pistol. The official ruling was suicide, and most historians accept this conclusion, though conspiracy theories have persisted for decades. Geli was only 23 years old. The circumstances surrounding her death remain somewhat mysterious, with various witnesses providing conflicting accounts of the days leading up to her death and Adolf's behaviour afterward. What is certain is that Adolf was devastated by Geli's death and became even more reclusive and paranoid afterward. Some historians argue that Geli's death was a pivotal moment in Adolf's psychological development, hardening him and removing one of the few people who had brought any softness to his personality. While Gelli's story ended before the full horrors of the Nazi regime unfolded, her surviving siblings faced the full weight of being Hitler's relatives after the war. Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr., Gelli's older brother, was born in 1906 and grew up in the same household as his sister. Unlike Gelli, Leo Rudolf maintained a cautious distance from his uncle Adolf, pursuing a career as an engineer and teacher. During the war, Leo Rudolf served in the German military but in a non-combat capacity, working as an engineer in Austria. This relative obscurity may have saved his life and certainly made his post-war existence easier than it might otherwise have been. After the war, Leo Rudolf Raubal faced interrogation by Allied authorities, but he was able to demonstrate that he had not been involved in Nazi party activities beyond the minimum required for professional advancement. He had joined the Nazi party in 1938, as most professionals in Austria were required to do after the Anschluss, but there was no evidence of active participation or enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. Leo Rudolf was released and allowed to return to his work as an engineer. He changed his name slightly, sometimes going by the surname Raubal Hitler, to acknowledge his family connection while emphasizing his maternal lineage. Leo Rudolf lived quietly in Austria for the rest of his life, rarely giving interviews and avoiding public attention. He married and had children, passing the burden of the Hitler family connection to the next generation. His descendants would face their own challenges growing up with Hitler's blood in their veins, even though they were born long after the war ended and had never known their great uncle. Leo Rudolf Raubal died in Austria in 1977, having lived a relatively unremarkable life despite his extraordinary family connection. The extended Hitler family included numerous other relatives scattered across Austria and Germany, many of whom had only tenuous connections to Adolf but nevertheless faced suspicion and prejudice after the war. Johann Georg Hitler, Adolf's paternal grandfather's brother, had numerous descendants who carried various forms of the Hitler surname or its variants. These distant cousins found themselves questioned by authorities, shunned by neighbors, and forced to explain their family connection at every turn. Some changed their names, moved to different countries, or simply lied about their heritage when asked. One particularly tragic case was that of Maria Koppensteiner, a distant cousin of Adolf Hitler who lived in a small Austrian village. Maria had met Adolf only once, briefly, at a family gathering in the 1920s when she was a child. She had no involvement in Nazi politics and had even helped hide a Jewish neighbor during the war, risking her own life to do so. Despite this act of courage and her obvious opposition to Nazi ideology, Maria faced years of harassment and suspicion after the war simply because of her surname and distant family connection. She was denied employment, ostracized by former friends, and lived in poverty for years before finally being accepted back into her community in the 1950s. Maria's story illustrates how the taint of the Hitler name extended far beyond those who had actually supported or benefited from the Nazi regime. The psychological impact of bearing the Hitler name cannot be overstated. Therapists and psychologists who later studied Hitler's relatives noted common patterns of trauma, including chronic anxiety, depression, feelings of inherited guilt, and a pervasive sense of shame that had nothing to do with their own actions. Many of Hitler's relatives reported nightmares, intrusive thoughts about the Holocaust, and an overwhelming fear of being discovered or recognized. Some developed elaborate strategies for hiding their identity, including creating false family histories, destroying family photographs and documents, and severing ties with other Hitler relatives who might inadvertently reveal their secret. The children and grandchildren of Hitler's siblings faced particularly acute challenges. These younger generation members had no personal connection to Adolf Hitler, had never met him, and in many cases were born after his death. Yet they carried his blood and his surname, and society seemed unwilling or unable to separate them from his crimes. Imagine being a teenager in the 1950s or 1960s and discovering that you were related to Adolf Hitler. Imagine the confusion, the shame, the fear of what others would think if they knew. For many of these young people, the revelation of their family heritage was traumatic, fundamentally altering their sense of identity and their place in the world. Parents struggled with the question of when and how to tell their children about their family connection to Hitler. Some chose to reveal the truth early, hoping that preparing their children would help them cope. Others delayed as long as possible, wanting to give their children a few years of normalcy before burdening them with this terrible knowledge. Still others never told their children at all, taking the secret to their graves and leaving their descendants to discover the truth accidentally, through family documents or genealogical research. Each approach had its own consequences, its own benefits and drawbacks, and none guaranteed that the next generation would be able to successfully navigate their impossible inheritance. The question of collective responsibility weighed heavily on Hitler's relatives. Were they responsible for Adolf's crimes simply by virtue of their shared blood? Did they owe some debt to Holocaust survivors and the descendants of those who had suffered under Nazi rule? Different family members answered these questions differently. Some, like Paula, refused to acknowledge any responsibility, insisting that they were innocent victims of their brother's actions. Others, particularly younger family members who came of age after the war, felt a profound moral obligation to atone for their relatives' crimes, even though they personally had done nothing wrong. This sense of inherited guilt drove some Hitler descendants to become activists for Holocaust education, human rights, and peace, using their unique position to speak out against hatred and intolerance. The media's fascination with Hitler's relatives added another layer of difficulty to their lives. Journalists constantly sought interviews with anyone connected to the Führer, offering money for their stories and sometimes resorting to deception and harassment to get the scoop they wanted. Hitler's relatives learned to be extremely cautious about whom they trusted, as former friends and even family members had been known to sell stories to tabloids for cash. This constant media pressure reinforced their isolation, making it difficult to form genuine relationships or trust anyone outside their immediate circle. Every new acquaintance had to be viewed with suspicion. Were they genuinely interested in friendship, or were they simply looking for a sensational story to sell? As the decades passed and the generation that remembered the war began to die off, some of Hitler's descendants hoped that the burden might finally ease. Perhaps younger generations who had no personal memory of World War II would be more willing to judge them as individuals rather than as extensions of their infamous ancestor. However, this hope proved largely unfounded. The Holocaust remains one of history's defining atrocities, and Hitler's name continues to symbolize absolute evil in popular consciousness. Each new generation discovers the horrors of the Nazi regime through education, films, books, and survivor testimonies, ensuring that Hitler's infamy never fades and his relatives never fully escape his shadow. While Paula, Angela, and Alois Jr. chose different paths in dealing with their notorious family connection, another relative would take a dramatically different approach, one that would lead him across the Atlantic Ocean and into a completely new identity. William Patrick Hitler, Adolf's nephew, would embark on a journey that would transform him from a potential beneficiary of Nazi power into one of its active opponents, serving in the very military forces fighting to destroy his uncle's regime. In 1944, a young sailor named William Patrick Hitler enlisted in the United States Navy. This seemingly ordinary event carried extraordinary weight and symbolism. William was the nephew of Adolf Hitler, the son of Alois Hitler Jr. and his abandoned Irish wife, Bridget Dowling. Born on March 12, 1911, in Liverpool, England, William had grown up far from the centres of German power, raised primarily by his mother after his father abandoned the family and returned to Germany. William's childhood was marked by financial struggle and the complicated question of his identity. He was German by blood, Irish by upbringing, and British by birth, a complicated heritage that would become even more complicated as his uncle rose to power in Germany. William's mother, Bridget, told a fascinating, though historically disputed story about Adolf Hitler's time in Liverpool. According to Bridget, Adolf visited her and Alois in Liverpool between November 1912 and April 1913, staying with them for several months. During this time, Bridget claimed, Adolf worked odd jobs and discussed his political ambitions, though he was still a nobody with grandiose dreams. Bridget later wrote a memoir detailing this visit, describing Adolf as lazy, argumentative, and prone to long-winded political rants that bored everyone who had to listen to them. However, historians have found no corroborating evidence for this visit, and many suspect that Bridget embellished or invented the story to add interest to her memoir, and perhaps to profit from her connection to the now infamous dictator. Whether Adolf actually visited Liverpool or not, William Patrick Hitler grew up hearing stories about his father's family in Germany and his famous uncle who was rising through the ranks of German politics. As a young man in the early 1930s, William was living in London and working in various low-level jobs, struggling to find his place in the world. When Adolf became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, William saw an opportunity. He decided to travel to Germany, hoping to capitalize on his family connection and secure a better position for himself. This decision would prove to be one of the most significant of his life, though not in the way he had anticipated. William arrived in Berlin in 1933, presenting himself as Adolf Hitler's nephew and expecting to be welcomed with open arms. Initially, he found some success. Through his uncle's influence, William was given a job at the Opel automobile factory in Berlin, a relatively prestigious position that paid well and came with certain perks. However, William quickly realized that his relationship with his uncle was far more complicated than he had imagined. Adolf was embarrassed by William's existence, viewing him as a reminder of his brother Alois's failed marriage and irresponsible behavior. Moreover, William's Anglo-Irish background made him suspect in Nazi circles where racial purity and German heritage were obsessively emphasized. William's relationship with Adolf soured rapidly. William wanted more opportunities, better positions, and greater recognition of his family connection. He felt entitled to share in his uncle's power and prestige. Adolf, on the other hand, wanted William to stay quiet, maintain a low profile, and stop reminding people that the Führer had relatives living in poverty in Britain. The tension between William's expectations and Adolf's preferences created a volatile situation that would eventually explode in spectacular fashion. Frustrated with his lack of advancement and the constant rebuffs from his uncle's inner circle, William made a reckless and dangerous move. In 1938, he threatened to expose embarrassing family secrets to the British press unless Adolf gave him a better position or substantial financial support. William claimed to have information about the Hitler family's Jewish ancestry, a rumor that had circulated for years but had never been proven. He also threatened to reveal details about Adolf's failed relationships, his time in Vienna as a homeless youth, and other personal matters that the Führer wanted kept private. This was an incredibly dangerous gambit. Adolf Hitler was now one of the most powerful men in Europe, commanding a ruthless regime that had no qualms about eliminating perceived threats. The blackmail attempt backfired spectacularly. Adolf's associates made it clear to William that his life was in danger if he remained in Germany. Whether Adolf would have actually ordered his nephew's death remains unclear, but William certainly believed he was at risk. In 1939, William fled Germany, returning to Britain just as war clouds were gathering over Europe. He had burned his bridges with his uncle and could never return to Germany while the Nazi regime remained in power. More importantly, William had seen firsthand the nature of the Nazi regime, its brutality, its racism, its militarism, and its complete disregard for human rights and dignity. These experiences would fundamentally shape William's understanding of his uncle and his own place in history. As World War II began, William found himself in an unusual position. He was the nephew of Britain's enemy, yet he was also a British subject who had been living in the United Kingdom. He made a series of lecture tours speaking about his uncle and the Nazi regime, positioning himself as someone with unique insider knowledge. William gave numerous interviews to newspapers and magazines, always emphasizing his opposition to his uncle's ideology and his support for the Allied cause. Some suspected these lectures and interviews were primarily motivated by financial need. William needed money and was willing to profit from his family connection, but others believed that William genuinely wanted to contribute to the fight against Nazism, even if his methods were unconventional. In 1939, William made the decision that would define his life. He chose to stay in the United States after a visit with his mother, who had emigrated there to escape the war in Europe. William applied for US citizenship and tried to enlist in the American military, but his application was initially rejected due to his German heritage and his family connection to Adolf Hitler. The US military was understandably suspicious of Hitler's nephew volunteering for service. Was this a genuine desire to fight fascism, or was William a potential spy or saboteur planted by German intelligence? William's persistence and his very public denunciations of his uncle eventually paid off. He wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt explaining his situation and asking for permission to join the US Armed Forces. The letter was a masterpiece of persuasion, combining personal narrative with patriotic sentiment. William explained that he had seen the Nazi regime from the inside, that he understood its evil nature and that he wanted to help defeat it. He argued that his unique position gave him a moral obligation to fight against his uncle's regime. Perhaps most importantly, he emphasized that he was choosing America and democratic values over blood ties and family loyalty. This appeal to American ideals of individual choice and personal responsibility resonated with the Roosevelt administration. In March 1944, William Patrick Hitler's application was approved, facilitated by a special dispensation from President Roosevelt himself. The decision to allow Hitler's nephew to serve in the US military was controversial and heavily debated within the administration. Some argued that it was a powerful propaganda tool, demonstrating that even Hitler's own relatives rejected his ideology. Others worried about the security risks and the possibility that William might be using his enlistment as cover for espionage activities. Ultimately, the propaganda value won out, and William was inducted into the United States Navy. William's naval service was carefully managed. He was assigned to a medical unit, working as a pharmacist's mate, a position that kept him away from sensitive military information, but allowed him to serve honorably. The Navy wanted to use William's story for propaganda purposes, but also needed to protect classified information and minimize security risks. William's presence in the US military was publicized, with newspapers running stories about Hitler's nephew fighting for America. These stories were designed to show that the Allied cause was so just that even Hitler's own family members had turned against him. For his part, William served competently, if not spectacularly, fulfilling his duties without complaint and avoiding any behavior that might bring negative attention. The irony of William's situation was not lost on anyone involved. Here was a man whose uncle had started a war that would kill tens of millions of people, now serving in the military forces dedicated to destroying that uncle's regime. William wore an American uniform, took orders from American officers, and worked alongside American servicemen, all while carrying a surname that those same servicemen were fighting to erase from history. His fellow sailors treated him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Some viewed him as a hero who had chosen the right side despite his family connection. Others wondered if he could really be trusted, if blood ties might ultimately prove stronger than ideology. William rarely discussed his uncle during his naval service, maintaining a professional distance from his family history whenever possible. However, he couldn't entirely escape it. When his identity became known, and it always eventually did, William would face questions about what Adolf was really like, whether the stories about Nazi atrocities were true, and whether William felt any guilt or responsibility for his uncle's actions. These conversations were painful and awkward, forcing William to constantly defend his own character while condemning his uncle. It was an exhausting emotional balancing act that took a significant toll on his mental health. During his time in the Navy, William was wounded in action when he was struck by shrapnel during a military operation. The injury was not life-threatening, but it was serious enough to earn him a Purple Heart, the US military decoration awarded to those wounded or killed in combat. This award was particularly symbolic. William Patrick Hitler, nephew of Adolf Hitler, had been wounded fighting against the Nazi regime. The Purple Heart represented his personal sacrifice and his complete break from his family's evil legacy. For William, receiving this decoration was an important moment of validation, proof that he had genuinely chosen the Allied side and had paid a price for that choice. William's military service ended when the war concluded in 1945. He was honorably discharged with the rank of pharmacist's mate 3rd class, and he received not only the Purple Heart but also other service medals recognizing his contribution to the war effort. However, the end of his military service marked the beginning of a new and equally challenging chapter in William's life. How could he build a normal existence after spending years as Hitler's nephew in the US military? How could he escape the constant attention and speculation about his family connection? These questions would dominate William's thinking for the rest of his life. In 1947, William married Phyllis Jean-Jacques, a woman he had met in New York. Phyllis knew about William's family connection before their marriage, and her willingness to accept him despite this burden was a crucial factor in William's decision to marry her. Phyllis would prove to be a stabilizing force in William's life, providing emotional support and helping him navigate the challenges of living with the Hitler name. The couple decided almost immediately that they needed to change their surname if they were ever to have a chance at a normal life. After much deliberation, they chose the surname Stuart Houston, a name that sounded Anglo-American and had no connection to their German heritage. This change was both practical and symbolic, a complete severing of ties to the Hitler family and an embrace of their new American identity. William and Phyllis Stuart Houston settled in Long Island, New York, where William opened a small medical laboratory supply business. They had 4 sons: Alexander, Louis, Howard, and Brian Stuart Houston. William was determined to give his sons the normal childhood he had never had, free from the constant scrutiny and prejudice he had endured. To his neighbours and business associates, William presented himself as just another World War II veteran trying to build a life in post-war America. He rarely spoke publicly about his family history, refusing interview requests and avoiding any situation that might draw attention to his past. William's business was modestly successful, providing enough income to support his family comfortably, if not lavishly. He worked long hours, partly out of economic necessity, and partly to keep himself busy and distracted from darker thoughts about his family heritage. William was a devoted father who tried to shield his sons from knowledge of their family connection for as long as possible. He wanted them to establish their own identities, to become confident and secure in themselves before having to confront the terrible reality of their great-uncle's crimes. This protective instinct was understandable, but it also created complications when the truth inevitably emerged. To those who knew him in Long Island, William Stuart Houston was an enigmatic figure. He was friendly, but distant, willing to make small talk but never discussing anything personal or revealing details about his past. Neighbours noticed that William and his family never displayed photographs of relatives, never mentioned extended family, and never received visits from anyone claiming to be a cousin or sibling. This complete isolation from family connections seemed odd to some, but most people respected William's privacy and didn't pry. In the conservative, conformist atmosphere of 1950s suburban America, minding your own business was considered a virtue, and William benefited from this cultural norm. Despite his best efforts to blend in and live normally, William could never entirely escape his past. Occasional newspaper articles would mention that Hitler's nephew was living in Long Island, leading to renewed interest from journalists and curiosity seekers. Each time this happened, William would face a new round of questions, stares, and unwanted attention. His children would come home from school asking why other kids were saying strange things about their family. William would deflect and minimize, promising to explain when they were older, but these incidents made it clear that complete anonymity was impossible. The Hitler name, even when legally changed, cast too long a shadow to be entirely hidden. William developed elaborate strategies for managing his public identity. When meeting new people, he would introduce himself simply as William Stuart Houston, never volunteering information about his past. If asked about his German accent, which never entirely disappeared despite years of living in English-speaking countries, he would explain that he had been born in England to a German father and had emigrated to America before the war. This was technically true, though it omitted the crucial detail about who his father's family was. William would carefully steer conversations away from family history, politics, or anything related to World War II. If pressed too hard, he would simply excuse himself and avoid that person in the future. The psychological toll of living with this secret identity was significant. William struggled with depression and anxiety throughout his adult life, though he rarely sought professional help for these issues. The stigma around mental health in the 1950s and 1960s made it difficult for anyone to admit they needed psychological support, and William had the additional concern that any therapist he might see would be unable to maintain confidentiality once they learned about his family connection. How could he honestly discuss his deepest fears and anxieties without revealing the source of those feelings? William felt trapped between his need for help and his terror of exposure. William's wife Phyllis proved to be his greatest source of support during these difficult years. She understood the burden he carried and helped him maintain the fiction of their new identity. Phyllis told their sons that their father's family had died during the war, which was technically true for some relatives, though it obscured the more complicated reality of why they had no contact with surviving family members. She managed the household finances, dealt with school administrators and teachers, and created a stable home environment that allowed William to focus on his work and his mental health. Without Phyllis's strength and dedication, William's life might have taken a very different and potentially tragic path. The couple had to make difficult decisions about how much to tell their children about their heritage. When Alexander, their oldest son, turned 13 in 1960, William finally sat him down for a painful conversation. He explained that their real surname was Hitler, that they had changed it to Stuart Houston for safety and privacy, and that Alexander's great-uncle was Adolf Hitler, the Nazi dictator responsible for World War II and the Holocaust. Alexander was stunned and horrified, unable to process the magnitude of what his father was telling him. For weeks afterward, Alexander struggled with feelings of shock, shame, and confusion about his identity. This pattern repeated with each of William's sons as they reached adolescence. Each revelation was traumatic, fundamentally altering how the boys saw themselves and their place in the world. Louis, Howard, and Brian each went through similar periods of shock and adjustment when they learned the truth about their family. The brothers found some comfort in having each other to talk to, sharing their feelings and supporting one another through the psychological turmoil of discovering their heritage. However, they also had to navigate complex feelings about their father, love and sympathy mixed with resentment that he had brought them into a world where they would always carry this terrible burden. William's relationship with his own mother, Bridget Dowling, was complicated in the post-war years. Bridget had written a memoir about her marriage to Alois Hitler and her alleged encounters with Adolf, hoping to profit from her connection to the dictator. William was ambivalent about his mother's decision to publicize their family history. On one hand, he understood that Bridget needed money and that her memoir was one of the few marketable skills she possessed. On the other hand, her publicity made it harder for William to maintain his anonymity and reinvent himself. Mother and son maintained contact, but at a distance, with William visiting Bridget occasionally, but always with caution and concern about being photographed or recognized. Bridget Dowling died in November 1969 in New York at the age of 78. Her death removed one of the last direct links to William's past life as Hitler's nephew. The funeral was small and private, attended only by William, his immediate family, and a few of Bridget's friends. Even in death, Bridget's connection to Adolf Hitler was mentioned in her obituary, ensuring that she could never escape the shadow of her former brother-in-law. For William, his mother's death was bittersweet. Grief mixed with a sense of relief that one more connection to his old identity had been severed. As the 1960s and 1970s progressed, William tried to live as normally as possible, focusing on his business and his family. He watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as Holocaust education became more prominent in American schools and culture. His sons would come home from history classes where they had learned about the final solution, about concentration camps, about the 6 million Jews murdered under Adolf Hitler's orders. They knew that this monster was their great uncle, that his blood ran in their veins. This knowledge created a profound sense of inherited guilt and shame, even though the boys had done nothing wrong and had never even met Adolf Hitler. William tried to help his sons understand that they were not responsible for their great-uncle's crimes, that family connection did not equal personal guilt. He would tell them stories about his own opposition to the Nazi regime, his service in the US Navy, his Purple Heart. William wanted his sons to see him as someone who had actively fought against evil, not as someone who had passively accepted his family legacy. These conversations helped to some degree, but they couldn't entirely erase the psychological burden of being Hitler's descendants. Meanwhile, other members of the Hitler family were facing their own struggles across the Atlantic. In Austria and Germany, various Hitler relatives continued to live in obscurity, trying to build lives despite their infamous surname. Peter Raubel, son of Leo Rudolf Raubel and grandson of Angela Hitler, worked as an engineer in Linz, Austria. Peter had been born in 1931, just 2 years before his great-uncle became Chancellor of Germany. He had grown up during the height of Nazi power, experiencing the war as a child and coming of age in the devastated post-war landscape of Austria. Peter Raubel's childhood had been marked by privilege and danger in equal measure. As Adolf Hitler's great-nephew, he had enjoyed certain benefits during the Nazi era: better food, protection from hardship, access to opportunities not available to ordinary Austrian children. However, he had also lived in constant fear of Allied bombing raids and the eventual collapse of the regime. Peter remembered the chaos of the war's final days, the terror as Soviet troops approached, and the confusion and uncertainty of the immediate post-war period. These traumatic childhood experiences shaped Peter's adult personality, making him cautious, reserved, and deeply private. After the war, Peter completed his education and trained as an engineer, deliberately choosing a technical field that would allow him to work without drawing attention to himself. He married an Austrian woman and had children, passing the Hitler family burden to yet another generation. Peter rarely gave interviews and refused most requests to discuss his famous great-uncle. When he did speak publicly, which was almost never, Peter would emphasize that he had been a child during the war, that he had no control over his family connection, and that he wanted to be judged as an individual based on his own actions and character. Peter's cousin, Heine Hochegger, another descendant of the Hitler family, followed a similar path of anonymity and professional achievement. Heine worked in a technical field, married, and raised a family while carefully guarding his privacy and avoiding any public discussion of his heritage. Like Peter, Heine understood that his family name was both an identifier and a curse. No amount of personal achievement or good character could entirely erase the stain of being related to Adolf Hitler. The best Heine could hope for was to live quietly, contribute positively to society in small ways, and perhaps allow time to slowly diminish the significance of his family connection. Other Hitler relatives scattered across Germany and Austria followed similar patterns. They changed their names, moved to different cities, and tried to blend into the general population. Some succeeded in maintaining complete anonymity for years or even decades. Others were eventually exposed by journalists or genealogists researching the Hitler family tree, leading to unwanted publicity and renewed scrutiny. In small towns and villages where everyone knew everyone else's business, maintaining anonymity was nearly impossible. Hitler relatives in these communities faced constant reminders of their family connection, from whispered comments to outright hostility. The question of what these relatives owed to Holocaust survivors and their descendants was a source of ongoing moral debate. Some argued that Hitler's relatives had a special obligation to speak out against hatred and intolerance, to use their unique platform to educate others about the dangers of fascism. Others contended that these individuals should be left alone, that they bore no responsibility for crimes committed before they were born or by relatives they had never met. This debate played out in newspapers, in academic conferences, and in countless private conversations among Hitler's relatives themselves. A few Hitler descendants chose to embrace a public role, speaking about their family connection and working to promote Holocaust education and reconciliation. These individuals faced their own challenges, as some people questioned their motives or accused them of trying to profit from their family name. Others praised them for their courage and their willingness to confront their family history honestly. For these public figures, every interview and every speech was carefully calculated to strike the right tone, acknowledging their family connection, expressing appropriate horror and regret, but also asserting their own separate identity and right to be judged as individuals. One such individual was Adolf Hitler's great-niece, whose identity has been kept confidential at her request. She spent years working with Holocaust education organizations, speaking to students about the importance of critical thinking, the dangers of charismatic leaders, and the need for ordinary citizens to resist tyranny. Her work was motivated by a deep sense of inherited responsibility. She felt that because she carried Hitler's blood, she had an obligation to try to undo some of the damage he had caused. This was an impossible task, of course, but her efforts were sincere and appeared to bring her some measure of peace with her heritage. However, not all Hitler relatives felt this sense of obligation or chose to engage publicly with their family history. Many simply wanted to live their lives in peace, pursuing careers, raising families, and contributing to their communities without the constant burden of explaining and justifying their existence. These individuals resented being forced into the role of representative or spokesperson for their entire family. They argued with considerable justification that they had done nothing wrong and should not be held accountable for their ancestors' crimes. The tension between these competing perspectives, public engagement versus private anonymity, created divisions within the Hitler family that persist to this day. The impact of the Hitler name on employment and career prospects cannot be overstated. Even those relatives who had changed their names legally often found that their true identity eventually came to light, usually through background checks or genealogical research conducted by curious colleagues. Once exposed, Hitler's relatives faced difficult decisions about whether to resign, whether to confront the situation directly, or whether to simply pretend nothing had changed and continue working as if their family connection didn't matter. Each approach had risks and potential consequences. Some employers reacted with surprising understanding and compassion when they discovered an employee's connection to Hitler. These enlightened managers recognized that an individual should not be judged by their family history, but by their own actions and character. However, other employers panicked, fearing that having Hitler's relative on staff would bring negative publicity or create problems with customers and clients. These employers would find excuses to terminate the employment, citing budget cuts or performance issues, while making it clear that the real reason was the employee's family connection. The children of Hitler's relatives faced particular challenges in schools. When their heritage became known to classmates, these children were often subjected to bullying, ostracism, and cruel jokes. Teachers and school administrators struggled with how to handle these situations, torn between protecting the child's privacy and addressing the legitimate educational interest in Holocaust history. Some schools handled these situations well, using the opportunity to teach about collective responsibility, the dangers of prejudice, and the importance of judging people as individuals. Other schools handled things poorly, either ignoring the bullying or inadvertently making it worse by calling excessive attention to the child's family connection. One particularly poignant case involved a Hitler descendant who was required to participate in a Holocaust education program at his school. The program included watching graphic footage from concentration camps and reading survivor testimonies. While these educational experiences are important and necessary for all students, for this particular child they carried additional psychological weight. He wasn't just learning about historical atrocities. He was learning about crimes committed by his own great-uncle, crimes that had made his surname synonymous with evil. The child developed severe anxiety and depression, requiring years of therapy to process the trauma of this experience. The advent of the internet in the late 20th century created new challenges for Hitler's descendants. Suddenly, genealogical information that had previously been difficult to access became readily available to anyone with a computer and an internet connection. Hitler family trees appeared on genealogy websites, often including information about living descendants and their current whereabouts. Privacy laws in some countries offered limited protection, but in practice it became increasingly difficult for Hitler's relatives to maintain anonymity in the digital age. Some hired lawyers to have their information removed from these websites, but new information would inevitably appear, requiring constant vigilance and ongoing legal battles. Social media presented additional challenges. Hitler's descendants had to be extremely careful about what they posted online, knowing that anything they shared could potentially be traced back to their true identity. Even seemingly innocuous posts about hobbies, vacations, or family events could provide clues that might lead to exposure. Some Hitler relatives chose to avoid social media entirely, accepting the social cost of digital isolation, rather than risk having their identity discovered and publicized online. Others used social media, but under carefully constructed false identities, always fearful that a single mistake might reveal who they really were. The question of whether Hitler's descendants should have children of their own was a source of profound moral and personal anguish. Some felt that bringing children into the world with Hitler's blood would be irresponsible, that they would be condemning another generation to carry an unbearable burden. Others argued that they had a right to normal family lives, that Hitler had already taken enough from his relatives, and that choosing not to have children would be allowing him one final victory over his own family. This debate was not abstract or academic for Hitler's descendants. It was deeply personal, touching on their most intimate desires and their sense of moral obligation to future generations. What happens when the weight of history becomes too much to bear? For Hitler's last living descendants, this question led to a drastic and final decision, one that would erase their family legacy forever. The story of the Stuart Houston brothers represents perhaps the most dramatic response to the burden of being Adolf Hitler's relatives, a response that speaks volumes about the inescapable nature of their family connection and the lengths to which they were willing to go to ensure that Hitler's bloodline would not continue into future generations. William Patrick Hitler, who had changed his name to William Stuart Houston, had 4 sons with his wife Phyllis, Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston, born in 1949, Louis Stuart Houston, born in 1951, Howard Ronald Stuart Houston, born in 1957, and Brian William Stuart Houston, born in 1965. These boys grew up in post-war America, the sons of a war veteran who had fought for the United States and earned a Purple Heart for his service. To their neighbors and schoolmates, they appeared to be typical American children living typical American lives. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a secret that would fundamentally shape their identities and life choices. Each of the Stuart Houston brothers learned about their true heritage at different ages, as their father, William, carefully chose the moments to reveal the terrible truth about their great-uncle. Alexander, as the oldest, was the first to learn. William sat him down shortly after his 13th birthday and explained as gently as possible that their real surname was Hitler and that they were related to one of history's most notorious criminals. Alexander's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by shock, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. How could his father have hidden something so important? How could he be expected to live with this knowledge? For weeks, Alexander barely spoke to his parents, processing the magnitude of what he had learned and trying to reconcile his understanding of himself with this new, terrible information. Louis learned the truth 2 years later at age 13 when he found documents in his father's study that revealed the family's original surname. Confronted with the evidence, William had no choice but to explain the full story to his second son. Louis's reaction was different from Alexander's. He became obsessed with learning everything he could about Adolf Hitler and World War II, reading dozens of books and watching documentary films, as if understanding the history might somehow help him understand himself. This intense focus on his great-uncle's crimes took a psychological toll on Louis, leading to depression and anxiety that would plague him throughout his life. Howard and Brian, the younger brothers, learned about their heritage in more controlled circumstances, as William and Phyllis had developed better strategies for handling these revelations after their experiences with Alexander and Louis. However, the knowledge was no less traumatic for being more carefully delivered. Each brother struggled in his own way with the realization that they carried the blood of a monster, that no matter what they did with their own lives, they would always be connected to genocide and atrocity through an accident of birth. Growing up in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, the Stuart Houston brothers faced unique challenges that their peers could never fully understand. They attended schools where Holocaust education was becoming increasingly prominent, sitting through lessons about concentration camps and the final solution while knowing that the man responsible was their great-uncle. They watched television programs about World War II, seeing their great-uncle portrayed as the embodiment of evil, and wondered if people would look at them the same way if they knew the truth. They celebrated American holidays and learned about American heroes, all while carrying a secret that made them feel fundamentally un-American and unworthy of the normal life they were trying to live. The brothers developed elaborate strategies for managing their secret identity. They agreed among themselves never to discuss their heritage with outsiders, never to respond to questions about their family history with anything more than vague generalities, and always to present themselves as ordinary Americans with nothing to hide. This conspiracy of silence was necessary for their psychological survival, but it also created a sense of isolation and alienness. They couldn't form truly intimate friendships because any close relationship would eventually require revealing the truth. They couldn't date without worrying about when and how to tell potential partners about their family connection. Every aspect of their lives was complicated by the secret they carried. As adults, the Stuart Houston brothers made conscious choices to blend into American society and avoid attracting attention. Alexander worked in social services, helping disadvantaged communities and trying to do some good in the world as a way of atoning for his family's crimes. Louis became a landscaper, working outdoors and avoiding the kinds of professional environments where his identity might become known. Howard pursued a career in the medical field as a laboratory technician, following in his father's footsteps by working in a technical capacity that required little social interaction. Brian, the youngest, worked various jobs throughout his life, never settling into a single career but always keeping a low profile and avoiding situations that might expose his identity. The brothers largely avoided media attention throughout their lives, granting only extremely rare interviews, and then only under conditions of strict confidentiality. When they did speak publicly, which happened perhaps 3 or 4 times over several decades, they emphasized their commitment to living normal lives, their distance from their great-uncle's ideology, and their desire to be judged as individuals, rather than as extensions of their family history. These interviews, when they occurred, were carefully managed affairs, with the brothers insisting on reviewing questions in advance and maintaining veto power over what could be published. Even with these precautions, they often regretted speaking publicly, finding that any media attention led to renewed interest from other journalists and curious members of the public. However, their most significant decision went far beyond career choices or media strategy. At some point in their adult lives, the 4 Stuart Houston brothers made a pact among themselves. They would not have children. This decision did not come easily or quickly. It was the result of years of discussion, debate, and soul-searching among the brothers as they grappled with the moral implications of passing their family burden to another generation. The pact represented the culmination of their lifelong struggle with their identity as Hitler's descendants and their determination to ensure that their great-uncle's bloodline would end with them. The decision not to have children was motivated by several factors, some practical and others deeply philosophical. On a practical level, the brothers recognized that any children they had would face the same psychological burden they had endured, the same need for secrecy, the same risk of exposure and public shame. They questioned whether it was fair or ethical to bring children into the world, knowing that those children would carry Hitler's blood and would have to spend their entire lives dealing with the consequences of that heritage. Was it right to condemn another generation to carry a burden they themselves found nearly unbearable? On a philosophical level, the brothers' decision was influenced by their understanding of Adolf Hitler's obsession with bloodlines, racial purity, and genetic legacy. Hitler had believed fanatically in the importance of Aryan heritage and had worked to eliminate entire populations based on their ancestry. By choosing to end Hitler's own bloodline, the Stuart Houston brothers were rejecting everything their great-uncle had stood for. It was a symbolic gesture that carried immense personal meaning. They were saying that Hitler's ideology was so abhorrent that even his own descendants refused to perpetuate his genetic legacy. In this way, they were having the final word in a conversation that had begun with their great-uncle's twisted racial theories. The pact also represented a form of self-sacrifice. Each of the brothers, at various points in their lives, had desires for family and children of their own. They saw friends and neighbors raising kids, experiencing the joys and challenges of parenthood, and passing on their values and knowledge to the next generation. The brothers wanted these experiences too, but they felt that their family heritage made such normal aspirations impossible, or at least morally questionable. This sacrifice was painful and required each brother to give up deeply held dreams about what his life might have been. The question of whether the brothers' decision was motivated by guilt, by a sense of inherited responsibility, or simply by a practical desire to avoid passing on their burden, has been debated by historians and psychologists. The brothers themselves have given somewhat contradictory explanations over the years. In some interviews, they have suggested that the decision was primarily about protecting potential children from having to carry the Hitler name. In other contexts, they have hinted that they felt a moral obligation to ensure that Hitler's bloodline ended, as if they bore some responsibility for their great-uncle's crimes simply by virtue of sharing his DNA. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors, a complex mix of protection, obligation, guilt, and a desire for symbolic justice. Not all family members agreed with the brothers' decision. Some Hitler descendants in Europe who learned about the pact criticized it as unnecessary and even as a form of surrender to Hitler's legacy. These critics argued that Hitler had already stolen too much from his family, and that allowing him to prevent the brothers from having normal lives and families was giving him one final victory. They contended that the proper response to Hitler's crimes was not to end his bloodline, but to live well, raise good children, and demonstrate that family heritage does not determine individual character or destiny. This debate within the Hitler family reflects deep philosophical differences about collective responsibility, guilt, and the power of bloodlines to define identity. William Stuart Houston, the brothers' father, died on July 14, 1987, in Patchogue, New York, at the age of 76. His death marked the end of an era for the family and removed the last person who had actually known Adolf Hitler personally and could provide first-hand accounts of what he had been like. William's death was reported in several newspapers, with obituaries noting his unusual life story, from Hitler's nephew to American war veteran to successful businessman living under an assumed name. For the Stuart Houston brothers, their father's passing was both a loss and, in some ways, a relief. They had loved William and appreciated the sacrifices he had made to give them a better life, but his death also meant that one more connection to their infamous heritage had been severed. After William's death, Phyllis Stuart Houston continued to live in Long Island, supported by her sons and maintaining the family's policy of strict privacy. Phyllis had been the rock of the family for decades, providing emotional support to both her husband and her sons as they navigated the challenges of their identity. She had accepted William despite his family connection, had helped raise 4 boys who carried Hitler's blood, and had never wavered in her commitment to protecting her family from unwanted attention. Phyllis died in the early tens, taking with her countless stories and memories that will never be fully known to historians or the public. Following their father's death and later their mother's passing, the Stuart Houston brothers became even more reclusive. They had inherited their parents' house in Long Island, and at least some of them continued to live there or nearby, maintaining their connections to the community where they had grown up. Alexander worked in social services. Until his retirement, Louis continued his landscaping business, Howard remained in the medical field, and Brian worked various jobs. To their neighbours, they were quiet, private men who kept to themselves but were always polite and never caused any trouble. Few people in the community knew or remembered their true identity, and those who did generally respected their privacy. The brothers' pact not to have children has been largely successful in remaining private, with details emerging only through occasional leaks to journalists and researchers. The brothers have never publicly confirmed or denied the pact, maintaining their characteristic silence about family matters. However, genealogical research and the lack of any known children born to any of the 4 brothers suggests that the pact is real and has been honoured. As of the writing of this history, the Stuart Houston brothers represent the last known direct descendants of Adolf Hitler's bloodline, and when they die, that bloodline will end forever. The psychological cost of the brothers' decision is difficult to quantify, but was certainly significant. Each brother, at various points in his life, has struggled with depression, anxiety, and feelings of isolation. They have had to watch friends and siblings of friends experience the normal milestones of family life, weddings, births, graduations, knowing that these experiences would never be theirs. They have had to explain to romantic partners why they could never marry or have children, leading to the end of relationships that might otherwise have become permanent. They have had to live with the knowledge that they are the last of their line, that when they die, no one will carry on their memories or their values to future generations. Yet despite these costs, the brothers have also expressed a sense of peace with their decision. In the rare interviews they have given, they have indicated that ending Hitler's bloodline feels like the right thing to do, the one meaningful action they can take to distance themselves from their great-uncle's legacy. They have suggested that the weight of their family heritage would be impossible to escape as long as Hitler's descendants continued to exist, that each new generation would face the same impossible challenges they have faced. By choosing to be the last generation, they are choosing to finally end the cycle of shame, secrecy, and psychological torment that has defined their family for 3 generations. The broader Hitler family in Europe has had mixed reactions to the American brothers' decision. Some relatives, particularly those who have chosen to have children of their own, view the pact as extreme and unnecessary. They argue that having children and raising them to be good people is the best possible response to Hitler's evil, a way of proving that genes do not determine destiny, and that one can be related to a monster without being monstrous oneself. These relatives have raised their children with an awareness of their family history, but also with a strong emphasis on individual responsibility, moral character, and the importance of standing against hatred and intolerance. Other Hitler relatives in Europe have expressed understanding and even admiration for the Stuart Houston brothers' decision. These relatives recognize the immense psychological burden of being Hitler's descendants and acknowledge that different people cope with this burden in different ways. Some have suggested that they wish they had made similar choices, that they regret bringing children into the world only to burden them with the Hitler family heritage. These expressions of regret and second-guessing reflect the ongoing psychological trauma that continues to affect Hitler's relatives generations after his death. The question of whether the Stuart Houston brothers' decision represents wisdom or tragedy has no easy answer. From one perspective, their choice to end Hitler's bloodline is a powerful act of moral clarity, a recognition that some legacies are too toxic to perpetuate. From another perspective, it is a tragedy that four men who never committed any crimes and who by all accounts are decent, hard-working individuals felt compelled to deny themselves the basic human experience of parenthood because of something their great-uncle did before they were born. Both perspectives have merit, and the brothers themselves seem to hold both views simultaneously, experiencing their decision as both necessary and deeply sad. The story of the Stuart Houston brothers cannot be told in isolation from the experiences of other Hitler relatives who made different choices. Across Europe, dozens of Hitler descendants have had children, raised families, and attempted to live normal lives while carrying their family burden. These individuals face daily challenges that most people never experience, deciding whether to tell friends and colleagues about their heritage, worrying about their children being bullied or ostracized if the truth becomes known, and living with the constant fear that a journalist or genealogist will expose their identity and destroy the life they have carefully built. One Austrian family, descendants of Hitler through his half-sister Angela, made the decision to keep their heritage completely secret from their own children until those children reached adulthood. The parents reasoned that childhood should be a time of innocence, and that burdening children with the knowledge of their Hitler connection would rob them of normal development and happiness. This strategy worked to some degree. The children did have relatively normal childhoods, but the eventual revelation was traumatic and led to feelings of betrayal and trust issues that took years to resolve. The adult children struggled to understand why their parents had lied to them for so long and wondered what other family secrets might be hidden. Another German family took the opposite approach, telling their children about their Hitler connection from an early age and making Holocaust education a central part of their family identity. The parents took their children to concentration camp memorials, had them read survivor testimonies, and encouraged them to think deeply about moral responsibility and the dangers of fascism. This approach created children who were well-informed and morally conscious, but it also created significant psychological burden. The children developed anxiety and depression, struggled with feelings of inherited guilt, and found it difficult to form their own identities separate from their family's terrible history. These divergent approaches to raising Hitler's descendants reflect the impossibility of the situation. There is no good way to tell children that they are related to Adolf Hitler. Every approach has consequences, every strategy has drawbacks, and no parent can fully protect their children from the psychological impact of this knowledge. Some children become activists and educators, some retreat into privacy and anonymity, and others develop serious mental health issues that require professional intervention. The outcomes seem to depend as much on individual psychology and circumstance as on any particular parenting strategy. The role of therapy and mental health treatment in the lives of Hitler's descendants has been significant. Many relatives have sought psychological help to deal with anxiety, depression, and trauma related to their family connection. However, finding therapists who can handle the unique challenges of being Hitler's descendant has proven difficult. Some therapists become overly focused on the family connection, treating it as the explanation for every problem the patient experiences. Others minimize the significance of the heritage, suggesting that the patient is being oversensitive or seeking attention. The most effective therapists are those who can acknowledge the real psychological burden of the Hitler name while also helping patients develop healthy coping mechanisms and a strong sense of individual identity separate from their family history. Group therapy with other Hitler descendants has been suggested by some mental health professionals as a potential solution, allowing relatives to share experiences and coping strategies with others who truly understand their situation. However, implementing such therapy has proven nearly impossible due to the privacy concerns and geographical dispersion of Hitler's relatives. Few descendants are willing to reveal their identity to other relatives they don't know, fearing that someone in the group might be a journalist in disguise or might later sell their story to the media. The lack of trust among Hitler's relatives, while understandable, has prevented them from accessing potentially helpful support systems. The legal status of Hitler's relatives has varied across countries and decades. In Germany and Austria, laws regarding names and identity documentation have sometimes made it difficult for Hitler relatives to fully escape their heritage. Some relatives have fought legal battles for the right to change their names or to have their family connection removed from public records. These battles have had mixed success, with courts sometimes siding with the individual's right to privacy and other times ruling that the historical significance of the Hitler name outweighs individual privacy concerns. These legal challenges have added stress and expense to lives already burdened by psychological trauma. Financial issues have also plagued Hitler's relatives. Some have faced difficulties obtaining employment when their identity becomes known, leading to periods of unemployment and financial hardship. Others have been approached by publishers, filmmakers, and media companies offering money for their stories. These offers are tempting, especially for relatives struggling financially, but accepting them means sacrificing privacy and potentially exposing one's identity to millions of people. Most Hitler relatives have refused these offers, valuing their anonymity more than money, but the financial pressure has been significant for some families. The question of inheritance and Hitler's personal property has created additional complications for some relatives. While Hitler himself died with relatively little personal property, most of his possessions were destroyed or looted in the chaos of the war's end. Some items did survive and were claimed by relatives or sold at auction. These items, from personal letters to pieces of furniture from his residences, have proven controversial. Should Hitler's relatives be allowed to inherit or profit from items connected to his legacy? Many relatives have wanted nothing to do with Hitler's possessions, refusing to accept inheritance of any items connected to him and preferring to let such items be donated to museums or historical archives. In one notable case, a Hitler relative inherited a painting allegedly created by Adolf during his years as an aspiring artist in Vienna. The relative was conflicted about what to do with the painting. Should it be destroyed, donated to a museum, or sold at auction? Ultimately, the relative chose to donate it to a museum with the stipulation that it never be publicly displayed, but only used for historical research. This decision reflected the relative's desire to neither profit from nor be associated with Hitler's legacy, while also recognizing the potential historical value of the artifact. The impact of Holocaust denial and neo-Nazi movements on Hitler's relatives has been an additional source of stress and danger. Some neo-Nazis have sought out Hitler's descendants, hoping to use them for propaganda purposes or to claim some form of legitimacy through association with Hitler's bloodline. These approaches are always unwelcome and sometimes threatening, forcing Hitler relatives to take security precautions and sometimes to move to new locations when their whereabouts become known to extremist groups. The irony of being both victimized by association with Hitler and targeted by his ideological successors is not lost on these relatives. Conversely, some Holocaust survivors and their descendants have confronted Hitler relatives, demanding acknowledgement, apology, or restitution. These confrontations, while understandable given the magnitude of the crimes committed, place Hitler's innocent relatives in an impossible position. They did not commit the crimes, were often born after the war ended, and may themselves be victims of Hitler's legacy in their own way. Yet they are asked to apologize, to feel guilt, to somehow make amends for atrocities they did not commit. Some relatives have chosen to engage with these confrontations, attending Holocaust memorial events and speaking about their family connection and their opposition to hatred. Others have felt that such engagement only reinforces their connection to Hitler and have refused to participate. The academic study of Hitler's family has raised ethical questions about privacy versus historical importance. Historians and genealogists argue that understanding Hitler's family is crucial for understanding the dictator himself and the social conditions that produced him. However, this academic interest comes at the cost of privacy for living descendants who have done nothing to deserve public scrutiny. Some scholars have tried to balance these concerns by anonymizing living relatives in their publications, referring to them by pseudonyms or only by their relationship to Hitler. Others have argued that the historical significance of the Hitler family outweighs individual privacy concerns and have published detailed family trees including names and sometimes addresses of living relatives. This academic scrutiny has real-world consequences for Hitler's descendants. When a historian publishes a family tree or a genealogist posts information online, it can lead to renewed media interest, harassment from neo-Nazis or Holocaust education activists, and destruction of carefully built anonymity. Some Hitler relatives have sued scholars and publishers for invasion of privacy, with mixed results. Courts have struggled to balance freedom of research and historical inquiry against individual rights to privacy and protection from harassment. The question of whether Hitler's relatives should be required to publicly acknowledge their heritage and speak out against hatred has been debated in various forums. Some argue that these individuals have a unique platform and a special moral obligation to use their family connection to educate others about the dangers of fascism and the importance of standing against tyranny. They contend that remaining silent is a form of complicity and that Hitler's relatives owe something to the victims of the Holocaust. Others argue that these individuals have a right to privacy, that they should not be forced to serve as educators or spokespeople, and that requiring them to publicly discuss their family connection is a form of punishment for crimes they did not commit. Several Hitler descendants who have chosen to speak publicly about their heritage have become important voices in Holocaust education. These individuals, while maintaining significant privacy about their personal lives, have given speeches at universities, participated in documentary films, and written essays about what it means to carry Hitler's name. Their work has been praised by Holocaust educators and survivors as providing a unique perspective that can reach people who might not otherwise engage with Holocaust history. However, these public figures have also faced criticism and harassment, both from neo-Nazis who view them as traitors to their heritage, and from some Holocaust survivors and their descendants who view any Hitler relative with suspicion and hostility. The experience of being a Hitler relative in different countries has varied significantly based on local culture, history, and attitudes toward World War II. In Germany and Austria, where the Holocaust is extensively taught and the burden of historical guilt is national as well as personal, Hitler's relatives face particular scrutiny and judgment. However, there is also more cultural understanding of the complexity of their situation, as many Germans and Austrians have their own family histories involving Nazi-era complicity or collaboration. In the United States, where World War II is remembered primarily as a victory rather than a source of national shame, Hitler's relatives can sometimes blend in more easily, though they still face challenges when their identity becomes known. In Israel, the very idea of Hitler's relatives living normal lives has been controversial. Some Holocaust survivors and their descendants find it deeply offensive that Hitler's blood. Relatives are allowed to exist peacefully when so many of their own families were murdered. This anger is understandable given the magnitude of the suffering inflicted by Hitler and his regime. However, most Israeli scholars and public figures have recognized that punishing people for their family connection, rather than their own actions, would repeat the kind of collective guilt that characterized Nazi ideology. This moral complexity has led to difficult conversations within Israeli society about justice, responsibility, and the meaning of punishment. The role of religion in the lives of Hitler's relatives has varied widely. Some have turned to Christianity, finding comfort in religious teachings about forgiveness, redemption, and individual accountability before God, rather than before history. These individuals have sometimes become devout believers, seeing their faith as a way to separate themselves from their family legacy and to connect with something transcendent and pure. Others have rejected religion entirely, viewing it as hypocritical, given that many Nazis were Christians who saw no contradiction between their faith and their participation in genocide. Still, others have explored Judaism, feeling drawn to the religion of Hitler's primary victims and seeking some form of understanding or connection with those who suffered most under their relatives' regime. One Hitler descendant who converted to Judaism faced particularly intense scrutiny and skepticism. Holocaust survivors and Jewish community members questioned the sincerity of the conversion, suspecting it might be motivated by guilt, attention-seeking, or a desire to profit from the novelty of being a Jewish Hitler relative. The conversion was controversial within the Hitler family as well, with some relatives viewing it as appropriate and meaningful, while others saw it as a publicity stunt or a betrayal of German heritage. The convert herself insisted that the decision was deeply personal and spiritual, but the controversy illustrates how even private religious choices become public issues when one's surname is Hitler. The impact of changing social attitudes over time on Hitler's relatives has been significant. In the immediate post-war years, the horror of the Holocaust was fresh, and the desire for justice was strong, leading to harsh treatment of anyone associated with Nazism, including innocent relatives. As decades passed and new generations came of age without personal memory of the war, attitudes softened somewhat, though Hitler remained the paradigmatic symbol of evil in Western culture. In recent years, as Holocaust survivors have died and the events of World War II recede further into history, there has been some discussion about whether Hitler's descendants should finally be allowed to move past their family connection and live without stigma. However, the rise of new forms of authoritarianism and renewed anti-Semitism in various parts of the world has made clear that the lessons of the Holocaust remain relevant and that Hitler will likely remain a powerful symbol of evil for generations to come. As we examine the final chapter of Hitler's family story, we must confront the reality that this burden will continue to affect his descendants for generations to come. The Stuart Houston brothers, now elderly men in their 70s and 80s, represent the last direct link to Adolf Hitler through his father's line. When they die, a chapter of history will close, but the legacy of their family connection will remain as a cautionary tale about the enduring consequences of evil and the price paid by those who are related to history's monsters through no fault of their own. Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston, the eldest of the brothers, has lived a quiet life dedicated to social service and community work. Born in 1949, Alexander came of age during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, periods of intense social upheaval in America. His work in social services has been his way of contributing positively to society and attempting to balance the scales of history in some small way. Alexander has never married and has no children, honoring the pact he made with his brothers decades ago. Those who know him describe him as a kind, thoughtful man who carries an air of sadness that he rarely explains. Alexander is now in his mid-70s, living in relative obscurity in New York State and maintaining the privacy that has defined his entire adult life. Alois Stuart Houston, the second brother, found his calling in landscaping and outdoor work. Born in 1951, Louis has spent his career creating beauty through gardens, parks, and outdoor spaces, perhaps as a counterweight to the ugliness of his family history. His work has brought him some measure of peace, providing physical labor that keeps his mind occupied and allows him to create something life-affirming from the earth. Like his brother Alexander, Louis never married or had children, and he has carefully guarded his privacy throughout his life. Colleagues and clients remember Louis as a skilled craftsman who took pride in his work but who never discussed his personal life or family history. Louis is now in his early 70s, still working part-time and living quietly in the Long Island area. Howard Ronald Stuart Houston, born in 1957, followed a career path similar to his father's, working in the medical field as a laboratory technician. Howard's choice of profession was deliberate. He wanted to contribute to healthcare and scientific advancement as a way of affirming life in opposition to his great-uncle's cult of death. Howard has spoken in extremely rare interviews about the psychological burden of his family connection, describing it as a weight that never entirely lifts, but that one learns to carry. He has also honored the family pact not to have children, choosing instead to dedicate his energy to his work and to supporting his brothers through their shared challenges. Howard is now in his late 60s, continuing to work in his field and maintaining the low profile that has characterized his life. Brian William Stuart Houston, the youngest brother, was born in 1965, 20 years after World War II ended. Brian's later birth meant that he grew up in a world where the war was already history rather than recent memory, but this distance did not lessen the burden of his family connection. Brian has worked various jobs throughout his life, never settling into a single career but always maintaining the family tradition of privacy and anonymity. Of all the brothers, Brian has perhaps been the most vocal about the unfairness of being judged for actions committed before he was born by a relative he never met. However, even Brian's rare expressions of frustration have been carefully controlled, avoiding any statement that might be seen as dismissing or minimizing the Holocaust. Brian is now in his late 50s, the last of the brothers still young enough to potentially reconsider the family pact, though there is no indication that he plans to do so. The Stuart Houston brothers' decision not to have children has effectively ended Adolf Hitler's direct bloodline through his father's line. When the last brother dies, there will be no more descendants carrying Hitler's Y chromosome or direct genetic heritage. This ending is both symbolic and practical. Symbolic because it represents the ultimate rejection of Hitler's racial ideology and his obsession with bloodlines, and practical because it means no more generations will have to carry the psychological burden of being Hitler's direct descendants. However, it's important to note that Hitler has other living relatives through his sisters and half-siblings who have chosen different paths and who have had children of their own. In Austria and Germany, various Hitler descendants continue to live with their family connection while attempting to maintain normal lives. These individuals, who are descendants of Hitler's sisters Paula and Angela, or of his half-brother Alois, face challenges similar to those faced by the Stuart Houston brothers, but have made different choices about how to respond. Some have changed their names but have had children, passing the family burden to the next generation, while hoping that the passage of time will eventually diminish the significance of their Hitler connection. Others have kept the Hitler surname or variations of it, either out of defiance, acceptance, or simply because they believe that running from their heritage is futile. Peter Raubal, grandson of Angela Hitler and one of Adolf's great-nephews, lived a long life as an engineer in Austria, dying in relative obscurity in the early 21st century. Peter had chosen to have children despite his family connection, and his descendants now represent the third and fourth generations removed from Adolf Hitler. These younger generations face a different kind of challenge than their grandparents and great-grandparents faced. For them, Adolf Hitler is not a relative they knew or even a contemporary figure in their parents' lives. He is a historical figure from a war that ended 3 or 4 generations ago, yet they still carry his blood. They still face questions about their heritage when it becomes known, and they still struggle with the question of what, if anything, they owe to history because of their family connection. The descendants of Alois Hitler Jr., through his son Heinz, who died in Soviet captivity during World War II, no longer exist in direct male line. However, Alois had other children whose descendants do survive, creating another branch of the Hitler family tree. These relatives have been even more successful at maintaining privacy than the Stuart Houston brothers, with some having entirely disappeared from public record and genealogical research. Their success in achieving anonymity reflects both their determination to escape their family legacy and the complicity of government officials and record keepers who have sometimes assisted Hitler relatives in changing their identities and erasing their family connections from public documents. The question of how history will ultimately judge Hitler's relatives remains open. Some historians and ethicists argue that these individuals deserve compassion and understanding, that they are victims of their family connection, rather than perpetrators of any crime. These scholars emphasize the psychological burden carried by Hitler's descendants and the unfairness of punishing people for their family heritage rather than their own actions. They point to the various ways Hitler's relatives have contributed to society through social service, education, quiet good citizenship, as evidence that family does not determine character and that Hitler's descendants have done their best to live honorably despite their terrible heritage. Other historians and ethicists take a harder line, arguing that Hitler's relatives, particularly those of his generation and the generation immediately following, benefited from his power and should bear some responsibility for having accepted those benefits. They note that some Hitler relatives, particularly Angela and to some extent Alois Jr., actively supported the Nazi regime or at least remained silent while atrocities were committed. While these scholars generally agree that younger generations who were born after the war should not be held personally responsible for Hitler's crimes, they argue that neither should these descendants entirely escape the moral weight of their family connection. This perspective sees Hitler's relatives as having an obligation to engage with their heritage, to contribute to Holocaust education, and to actively work against the kind of hatred and intolerance that their relative embodied. The debate over collective versus individual responsibility is not unique to Hitler's family, but takes on particular significance in their case. The Holocaust was an unprecedented crime, and Adolf Hitler remains the most potent symbol of evil in modern history. The question of whether his relatives bear any responsibility for his crimes touches on fundamental issues of justice, guilt, and the extent to which we are our brother's keepers. These are not academic questions for Hitler's descendants. They are lived realities that affect every aspect of their lives, from where they live, to what careers they pursue, to whether they choose to have children. The role of the media in shaping public perception of Hitler's relatives cannot be overstated. Sensationalized documentaries, tabloid articles, and social media posts have often portrayed Hitler's descendants as either secretly sympathetic to Nazi ideology or as tragic figures crushed by their family burden. Both portrayals are oversimplifications that fail to capture the complexity and diversity of experiences among Hitler's relatives. Some relatives have been harassed by media attention to the point of having to move multiple times and change their identities. Others have used media appearances to try to control their narrative and present themselves as opponents of everything their infamous relatives stood for. The relationship between Hitler's descendants and the media remains fraught and complicated, with neither side fully trusting the other. In recent years, DNA testing and genealogical research have made it increasingly difficult for Hitler's descendants to maintain complete anonymity. Various genetic testing companies have created massive databases of DNA information that can be used to trace family connections, and amateur genealogists have become increasingly sophisticated in their ability to track down relatives of historical figures. Some Hitler descendants have found their identities exposed through these means, leading to renewed media attention and public scrutiny. This technological change has fundamentally altered the landscape for Hitler's relatives, making the kind of complete anonymity that some achieved in earlier decades nearly impossible to maintain. The ethical implications of exposing Hitler's descendants through genealogical research have been debated among historians, ethicists, and privacy advocates. On one hand, understanding Hitler's family is important for historical research and for understanding the social and genetic factors that may have contributed to his psychology and worldview. On the other hand, exposing living individuals who have committed no crimes and who have actively worked to distance themselves from their family heritage seems cruel and unjust. Some genealogists have adopted ethical guidelines that protect living descendants of controversial historical figures, while others argue that historical significance overrides privacy concerns and that Hitler's relatives should be treated differently from descendants of other historical figures. The question of whether Hitler's genetic material should be preserved for scientific study has also been controversial. Some scientists have argued that Hitler's DNA could provide valuable insights into the genetic basis of personality disorders, psychopathy, or other traits that contributed to his capacity for evil. However, this scientific interest runs up against both practical and ethical concerns. Practically, obtaining authentic Hitler DNA has proven difficult, and the quality of any samples that do exist is questionable. Ethically, even if good samples were available, using them for research could be seen as violating the rights of Hitler's living descendants, who might not want their relatives' genetic material studied and publicized. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Hitler's descendants has been similar to its impact on millions of other families around the world, but with some unique dimensions. The social isolation and economic disruption caused by the pandemic affected Hitler relatives just as it affected everyone else. However, for some Hitler descendants who had relied on face-to-face interactions and personal relationships to build trust and acceptance in their communities, the shift to digital communication and online interaction made maintaining their privacy more challenging. Video calls and social media require greater disclosure of personal information, and the informal background checks that have become common in online interactions made it harder to control when and how their family heritage might be revealed. As we move further into the 21st century, the question of how long Hitler's descendants will continue to face stigma and discrimination remains open. On one hand, the Holocaust remains a central event in modern history, and Hitler remains the ultimate symbol of evil in Western culture. Films, books, museums, and educational programs ensure that each new generation learns about Hitler and the Nazi regime, keeping his infamy fresh in public consciousness. This ongoing attention makes it unlikely that Hitler's descendants will ever be entirely free of their family burden, at least not in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, time does eventually heal many wounds, and it's possible that several more generations from now, when Hitler's descendants are separated from him by a century or more, the stigma may finally fade to the point where these individuals can live truly normal lives. By that time, Hitler will be as distant historically as Napoleon or other historical villains who, while still remembered as evil, no longer carry the same emotional charge they once did. However, this assumes that the lessons of the Holocaust remain learned and that new genocides and atrocities don't occur that keep the memory of Hitler fresh as a warning about what can happen when societies embrace hatred and authoritarianism. The Stuart Houston brothers have lived their entire adult lives in the shadow of their great-uncle's crimes, carrying a burden they did nothing to deserve. Their decision to end Hitler's bloodline represents one response to this impossible situation, a response characterized by self-sacrifice, moral seriousness, and a determination to ensure that their family's dark legacy ends with them. Whether this decision was wise or tragic, necessary or extreme, is ultimately for each individual to judge. What is clear is that the brothers made their choice deliberately and consciously, after years of thought and discussion, and that they have lived with the consequences of that choice with dignity and grace. As the Stuart Houston brothers enter their final years, they can take some comfort in knowing that they have lived honorable lives despite their family connection. They have worked in their communities, contributed to society in positive ways, and harmed no one. They have chosen to end Hitler's bloodline not because they believe in genetic determinism, but because they recognize that the psychological burden of being Hitler's descendant is too great to pass on to another generation. Their sacrifice, giving up the normal human experience of parenthood and family, is a profound testament to the enduring power of Hitler's evil and the lengths to which even innocent relatives have had to go to escape its shadow. The deaths of Hitler's immediate siblings marked important milestones in the family's post-war history. Paula Hitler-Wulff died on June 1, 1960, in Berchtesgaden at the age of 64, having lived in poverty and obscurity for 15 years after the war ended. Her death was barely noted in newspapers, meriting only brief mentions that identified her as Hitler's sister. Paula was buried in a cemetery near Berchtesgaden, her grave marked with her adopted surname Wulff, rather than her birth name. For years after her death, her grave remained unmarked and unmaintained as local authorities were reluctant to create anything that might become a shrine for neo-Nazis or a target for vandalism by those who hated everything connected to Hitler. Angela Hitler, Adolf's half-sister and once one of his closest confidants, had died earlier on October 30th, 1949, in Hanover. Angela was 66 years old at the time of her death, having lived only 4 years beyond the war's end. Unlike Paula, who had maintained some contact with other family members, Angela died relatively isolated, having alienated many relatives through her continued defense of Adolf and her refusal to acknowledge the full horror of his crimes. Angela's funeral was attended by only a handful of relatives, and even they kept their attendance quiet to avoid unwanted attention. Angela's death removed one of the last people who had been part of Adolf Hitler's inner circle during the height of his power, taking with her memories and perspectives that would never be fully documented. Alois Hitler Jr., Adolf's half-brother and father of William Patrick Hitler, died on May 9, 1956, in Hamburg at the age of 74. Alois had spent the post-war years attempting to rebuild his life and his restaurant business, with limited success. His death was marked by local Hamburg newspapers, which noted his relationship to Adolf Hitler but focused primarily on his own life story and his attempts to distance himself from his infamous half-brother. Alois was buried in Hamburg, and like his sisters, his grave was intentionally kept low profile to avoid attracting unwanted attention from either neo-Nazis or protesters. The deaths of these immediate siblings of Adolf Hitler meant that by the late 1960s, there were no longer any living people who had known Hitler as a child or young adult. All remaining Hitler relatives were members of younger generations who had known him only as the adult dictator or not at all. This generational shift changed the nature of the family burden in subtle ways. The older generation had carried personal memories of Adolf as a brother, uncle, or nephew, memories that complicated their ability to fully condemn him because they remembered moments of kindness or normalcy. The younger generations carried only the burden of historical association, which in some ways was simpler. They could condemn Hitler without reservation because they had no personal memories to complicate their judgment, but in other ways was more difficult because they had to live with a burden they had no personal connection to at all. The preservation and destruction of Hitler family artifacts has been a contentious issue. After the war, Allied forces seized numerous personal items belonging to Hitler and his family, including letters, photographs, furniture, artwork, and personal effects. Some of these items were destroyed immediately, seen as too contaminated by association with evil to preserve. Others were placed in archives and museums, where they remain to this day, providing valuable historical evidence but also serving as uncomfortable reminders of Hitler's existence. Family members have had varying attitudes toward these artifacts, with some wanting them destroyed entirely, and others believing they have historical value that justifies their preservation. One particularly controversial artifact was Hitler's collection of family photographs, which included images of him with his siblings, nephews, and other relatives. These photographs, seized by Allied forces and eventually placed in archives, provided valuable historical information about Hitler's early life and family relationships. However, they also created ethical dilemmas for archivists and historians. Should these images be publicly displayed, potentially invading the privacy of living relatives who appear in the photographs? Should they be restricted to researchers only? Should they be destroyed to prevent them from being used for neo-Nazi propaganda? Different institutions have answered these questions, differently, with no clear consensus emerging. The question of Hitler family burial sites has also been problematic. Paula Hitler's grave in Berchtesgaden, Angela Hitler's grave in Hanover, and Alois Hitler Jr.'s grave in Hamburg have all required special management to prevent them from becoming either neo-Nazi shrines or targets for vandalism. In some cases, local authorities have removed markers from these graves or have allowed them to become overgrown to discourage visitors. In other cases, families of Hitler's relatives have had their loved ones' remains moved to undisclosed locations to prevent publicity. The difficulty of even properly burying Hitler's relatives reflects the extent to which the Hitler name has become toxic, affecting even the final resting places of people who committed no crimes. The impact of changing demographics and globalization on Hitler's descendants has created new challenges and opportunities. As populations have become more mobile and diverse, Hitler's relatives have sometimes found it easier to blend in and avoid detection in cosmopolitan urban areas where people are less interested in their neighbors' backgrounds. However, this same globalization has also meant that Holocaust education has spread worldwide, making Hitler's name and crimes known in places where they might previously have been less prominent. A Hitler descendant living in Asia or South America might face different challenges than one living in Europe or North America, but the fundamental burden of the family connection remains similar regardless of geography. The question of how to memorialize or remember Hitler's innocent relatives has no easy answer. Should there be monuments or memorials to Paula, Angela, or other relatives who suffered because of their family connection? Should historians write sympathetic biographies of these individuals, acknowledging their victimhood while also noting their complicity or silence? Or should these individuals be allowed to fade into obscurity, their stories noted briefly in historical accounts, but not elevated to the status of tragic figures worthy of extensive study? Different historians and ethicists have different views, and the Hitler family members themselves have had divided opinions on how they want to be remembered, if at all. The legal and ethical status of Hitler's intellectual property has created additional complications for his family. While Hitler wrote Mein Kampf and various other documents during his lifetime, the copyright status of these works has been contested for decades. In Germany, the state of Bavaria held the copyright to Mein Kampf for many years and used it to prevent republication, though this copyright expired in 2016, leading to new annotated editions being published for educational purposes. Hitler's relatives have generally wanted nothing to do with any potential royalties or rights related to his work, viewing any financial benefit from his writings as morally unacceptable. However, this rejection has not prevented others from profiting from Hitler-related materials, creating a situation where strangers benefit financially from Hitler's notoriety, while his innocent relatives continue to suffer from their association with him. The psychological phenomenon of inherited trauma has been extensively studied in Holocaust survivor families, but it also applies to Hitler's descendants in a twisted way. Just as children of Holocaust survivors often carry psychological burdens related to their parents' trauma, Hitler's descendants carry psychological burdens related to their ancestors' crimes. Both groups struggle with questions of identity, guilt, and the extent to which the past should define the present. However, the nature of the trauma is obviously very different. Holocaust survivors and their descendants were victims of unspeakable evil, while Hitler's descendants are connected to the perpetrator of that evil. This fundamental difference means that while both groups experience inherited trauma, society responds to them very differently, offering sympathy and support to Holocaust survivor families while offering suspicion and judgment to Hitler's relatives. Some psychologists who have studied Hitler's descendants have noted common psychological patterns, including chronic anxiety, depression, perfectionism, and an intense need to prove their moral worth through good works and exemplary behavior. These individuals often hold themselves to impossibly high standards, believing that any moral failure on their part will be seen as evidence of their inherited evil. This psychological pressure can be crushing, leading to burnout, mental health crises, and in some tragic cases, suicide. The lack of support systems for Hitler's descendants, combined with the stigma that prevents them from seeking help openly, has created a situation where these individuals often suffer in isolation with little access to appropriate mental health care. The role of forgiveness in the lives of Hitler's descendants is complex and varied. Some relatives have sought forgiveness from Holocaust survivors and their descendants, attending memorial events and trying to make amends in whatever small ways they can. However, this seeking of forgiveness is itself controversial. Some argue that Hitler's innocent relatives have nothing to seek forgiveness for, that they are victims themselves and should not be made to apologize for crimes they did not commit. Others argue that seeking forgiveness is appropriate as a way of acknowledging the pain caused by their relative and expressing solidarity with victims. The question of who can forgive and what there is to forgive remains unresolved and probably unresolvable. The future of Hitler's family legacy depends largely on choices made by current generations of descendants. If they continue to maintain privacy and avoid public engagement, the family connection may gradually fade from public consciousness as Hitler becomes increasingly distant history. If some descendants choose to become public figures and educators, using their unique position to teach about the dangers of hatred and authoritarianism, the family connection may remain prominent but potentially be reframed in a more positive light. If neo-Nazis or others continue to seek out Hitler's descendants for propaganda purposes, the family may continue to face harassment and danger requiring ongoing security measures. Each of these scenarios is possible, and the actual future will likely involve elements of all three. The preservation of oral histories and personal testimonies from Hitler's relatives has been incomplete and problematic. Some relatives, particularly those of the first generation after the war, were interviewed by historians and journalists, leaving records of their experiences and perspectives. However, many others refused all interviews, taking their stories to their graves. This selective preservation means that future historians will have an incomplete and possibly skewed understanding of what it was like to be Hitler's relative in the post-war period. The relatives who agreed to speak publicly may not have been representative of the family as a whole, and their willingness to speak may have been motivated by factors that influenced what they said and how they said it. The Stuart Houston brothers proved that history's weight doesn't just disappear, it lingers. Their choice was the ultimate rejection of Hitler's obsession with legacy. In the end, his bloodline ended, not by force, but by choice. The brothers' decision stands as a powerful symbol of how Hitler's crimes continue to reverberate through generations, affecting people who were born long after his death and who bear no personal responsibility for his actions. Their story is both inspiring in its moral clarity and tragic in its acknowledgement that some legacies are too toxic to perpetuate, even through innocent descendants. As we conclude this exploration of what happened to Hitler's family after World War II, we are left with profound questions about guilt, responsibility, and the extent to which family heritage determines individual identity. Hitler's relatives have provided no easy answers to these questions, with different family members choosing different paths and making different moral calculations about how to live with their impossible heritage. Some chose anonymity and silence, others chose public engagement and education, and still others chose to end their bloodline entirely. Each approach reflects a different understanding of what it means to be Hitler's descendant and what obligations, if any, come with that designation. The story of Hitler's family after World War II is ultimately a human story about ordinary people trying to live extraordinary circumstances. These individuals did not choose their family connection, they did not support Hitler's crimes, and most of them were born after the war ended. Yet they have spent their entire lives carrying the burden of being related to history's most notorious criminal. Their stories remind us that the consequences of evil extend far beyond the direct victims and perpetrators, affecting families, communities, and future generations in ways that are often unforeseen and always painful. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video, What Happened to the Children of Nazi Leaders After World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more WW2 content. See you in the next one. You in.